the heart of southern Africa, where the wind moves softly over the high plateau and the earth glows with the quiet fire of iron-red dust, lie the ruins of a city that defies time. Stone walls rise and twist like the memory of a dream, enclosing silence within their ancient embrace. They are not mere remnants of a forgotten age. They are whispers carved in granite, a testament to a civilization that once shimmered like a mirage above the savannas. This is Great Zimbabwe. It stands in the imagination like an echo, vast, mysterious, impossible. The very name Zimbabwe means house of stone, but these are no ordinary stones. They are fitted together with such precision that even centuries of wind and rain have failed to pry them apart. No mortar holds them, only the careful genius of hands that understood both balance and eternity. When the first European explorers stumbled upon these walls in the 19th century, they could not believe that Africans had built them. Their minds, trapped by prejudice, conjured myths of Phoenician gold miners or lost Hebrew kingdoms. Yet the truth lay closer to home and far more magnificent. For centuries before European ships ever touched the African coast, Great Zimbabwe had been a city of merchants, kings and artisans, an empire of trade and faith, born of the earth itself. But what could have caused its fall? How could such a place, once alive with music, cattle bells, and the glitter of gold, become a city of ghosts? To understand that, we must begin not with its ruin, but with its miracle. Long before the world heard the name Zimbabwe, people had begun to gather in the fertile valleys of the highlands. Here, between the Limpopo and Zambezi rivers, the rains were kind and the soil generous. The Shona-speaking peoples, ancestors of those who would build the city, learned to coax abundance from the land. They raised cattle, the currency of prestige and power. They smelted iron from the dark red earth, hammered copper, and found gold gleaming in the riverbeds. But something deeper stirred among them, a vision of permanence. Across centuries of migration and trade, they had seen villages rise and vanish like sparks. They wanted something that would last. So they began to shape stone, not to build shelters against the sun, but to build symbols, to build a legacy. At first, their walls were modest enclosures for livestock, foundations for the homes of chiefs. But as their confidence and skill grew, the stones became larger, the ambitions grander. By the 11th century, Great Zimbabwe was no longer just a settlement. It was a statement. Imagine approaching it then, miles of rolling grassland stretching toward a cluster of granite hills. Smoke drifting from cooking fires, the distant hum of markets alive with trade. Herds of cattle grazing beneath the watchful eyes of herders. And at the center of it all, the great enclosure, a vast circular wall soaring over 10 meters high, enclosing a maze of passageways and towers. It was both fortress and temple, palace and myth. Inside, the air was cool and dim. Drums echoed through narrow stone corridors. Women ground grain beneath the shadows of towering walls, their rhythmic motion blending with the song of birds and the faint ring of metalwork. The king's court pulsed with ritual and command. His word was law, his presence divine. From the outside, traders came from far and wide. Arabs from the Swahili coast brought beads and cloth, their caravans shimmering with color. They traded for gold, ivory, and the precious hides of leopards. From Zimbabwe's hinterlands came iron and cattle, millet and sorghum. The city became a crossroads, a meeting of worlds. Yet amid this prosperity, something fragile flickered. Greatness, after all, is not eternal. It feeds upon itself. And within the rhythm of abundance, there's always the quiet drumbeat of decline waiting for its cue. But for now, in these early centuries, Great Zimbabwe stood unchallenged. The empire it governed stretched across 1,000 kilometers, connecting distant valleys and rival chiefdoms under one idea: that unity and wealth could be born from stone. The stones themselves seemed to breathe. In the mornings, mist from the highlands rolled over them, turning the city into a silver mirage. In the evenings, when the sun sank low, the granite glowed like embers. Travelers who reached its walls spoke of awe, of feeling small before the hands that shaped such perfection. No parchment records its laws. No inscriptions tell its story. Its memory was carried by voice and song, by ritual and inheritance. It was a civilization that believed that the past did not need to be written to be real. It only needed to be remembered. Centuries later, when colonial explorers arrived, they tried to erase that truth. They could not accept that black Africans had built a city of such scale and complexity. They dug through ruins searching for evidence of foreign architects, inventing tales to suit their own pride. But the stones themselves did not lie. Beneath them, archaeologists would later find shards of pottery identical to those still used in nearby villages, ornaments of local design, and iron tools forged from the surrounding hills. The evidence was undeniable. This greatness was African. Entirely, triumphantly African. And yet, even as we celebrate its rise, shadows begin to gather. In every empire's heartbeat, there's a rhythm of ascent and descent. Prosperity can sow the seeds of its own undoing. When wealth pools too deeply, it invites envy. When power centralizes, it breeds fracture. When the land gives and gives, one day it demands its due. Great Zimbabwe was not felled by a single blow. It was undone by a slow unraveling, a tapestry of causes interwoven across generations. Environmental strain, shifting trade routes, political rivalries, and the silent exhaustion of the land itself. But these are only the bones of the story. The soul of its fall lies deeper in the choices its people made, and in the quiet, unseen forces that shaped the destiny of nations long before history wrote their names. For now, as we stand before its broken towers, we must ask not just how it fell, but what it means. The stones of Great Zimbabwe still hold their secrets, waiting for us to listen. And in their silence, we begin to hear the faint echo of what was lost, the hum of life within those granite walls, the pride of a people who dreamed that their city might outlast time itself. The story of Great Zimbabwe's fall does not begin with disaster, it begins with glory. For centuries, the city thrived, its walls alive with laughter and labor, its markets humming with exchange. The rhythm of daily life was steady and assured. The people believed the city's heart was unbreakable. But even the strongest stone is not immune to time. In the 12th and 13th centuries, the Empire of Zimbabwe reached its height. Its rulers controlled the gold that glimmered in the rivers and veins of the surrounding hills. This gold flowed eastward, carried by merchants across the savannah to the coast of the Indian Ocean, where it met the world beyond Africa. There, on the shores of Sofala and Kilwa, Swahili traders waited with ships bound for Arabia, Persia, and distant India. From these ports, the wealth of the inland kingdom transformed into silks, porcelain, beads, and spices. And the gold of Zimbabwe, pure, radiant, and abundant, fed the hunger of empires far away. In time, Great Zimbabwe became not just a city, but a symbol, a node in the invisible network of the medieval world's commerce. It stood as Africa's inland jewel, gleaming beneath the sun. The king, or Mambo, sat at the center of this radiance. His authority flowed outward through a web of kinship and tribute. He was the guardian of cattle, the keeper of spirits, the bridge between the ancestors and the living. Around him, courtiers and priests shaped a society governed by ritual and hierarchy. Cattle symbolized wealth. Wives and alliances multiplied power. Every exchange, every gesture was a thread in the fabric of belonging. But as the city expanded, so too did its appetite. Thousands of people lived within and around the granite walls. Each household needed food, wood, and space for their animals. The plateau's environment, though rich, was not infinite. Hills were stripped for timber to fire kilns and smelters. The surrounding soil, once dark and generous, grew pale and weary under constant cultivation. The rivers, heavy with silt, began to change their moods. Where once they had nourished crops, they now carved deeper beds, their waters carrying away the fertile earth. The city's reach, its trade, its grandeur, its population was becoming too heavy for the land that sustained it. But the signs were subtle. Empires seldom see their decline as it begins. To those who lived within Great Zimbabwe's walls, life still pulsed with confidence. The drums of ceremony still beat in the courtyards. Traders still arrived, their camels and oxen loaded with goods. The horizon still shimmered with promise. What they could not see was that the balance, the delicate dance between human ambition and nature's endurance was tipping. Far to the east, along the coast, another transformation was unfolding. The Swahili city-states, those shimmering pearls along the Indian Ocean, were growing ever more powerful. Kilwa, in particular, rose to dominate the trade in gold. The rulers of Kilwa extended their influence inland, seeking to control the flow of wealth from the mines and rivers of Zimbabwe. For centuries, this trade had depended on mutual need. The inland kingdoms provided gold and ivory. The coast provided access to the vast world beyond, but power shifts like sand. When one side grows too strong, balance breaks. By the late 14th century, Kilwa's merchants began favoring new routes and new sources. To the south, emerging centers like Mutapa and Torwa began to rise, offspring kingdoms born from Zimbabwe's lineage but hungry for their own destiny. The flow of trade that had once nourished the great city began to bend away, like a river changing course. Still, within the high walls of the great enclosure, ceremony endured. The royal court clung to its symbols, the conical tower, the stone birds, the sacred fire that burned for generations. But outside, something was changing. The people of the countryside, feeling the strain of depleted land and lost trade, began to drift. Villages relocated to fresher soils, smaller communities forming where once there had been a single beating heart. It is hard to see collapse from within it. To those who lived through those years, life did not simply end, it shifted. The songs changed, the patterns of trade altered, the festivals grew quieter. Power did not shatter overnight. It dissolved, grain by grain. Even nature joined the exodus. Herds that once grazed near the walls moved to new pastures. Wells that had quenched the city's thirst grew shallow. The rains came late, then failed entirely. Some say the gods had turned their faces away. Others whispered that the ancestors were restless, that something in the moral order had fractured. And perhaps they were right. For civilizations are not only undone by hunger or drought, they are undone by belief. When the invisible thread that binds a people to their gods and to one another begins to fray, walls, no matter how strong, cannot hold the pieces together. Still, Great Zimbabwe resisted. Even as cracks appeared, it remained a place of reverence. The king sought to reassert control over trade and land, dispatching envoys to distant mines, reaffirming old alliances. But the world around them was shifting too quickly. To the north, new powers, Mutapa above all, were learning from their parent kingdom's glory and mistakes. They adopted its architecture, its symbols, even its claim to divine kingship, while moving closer to the roots that now carried the pulse of trade. Great Zimbabwe, the mother of stone, had given birth to her heirs. But in doing so, she had sown the seeds of her own eclipse. Imagine the moment when silence began to settle over those granite corridors. When the last fires dimmed in the courtyards. When the sound of hammers and bells faded into the cry of birds. The walls did not crumble, they simply emptied. People carried their memories and their gods elsewhere. The ancestors followed them, leaving the stones to sleep beneath the sky. Centuries later, explorers would arrive and find only mystery. They would marvel at the craftsmanship, the scale, the endurance of what they could not understand. But the people who had once called it home, descendants of those same builders, still carried the name. Zimbabwe in their tongues, still told the stories of the stone city that had stood as proof of their greatness. What caused its fall? The answer is neither simple nor singular. It was nature and time, ambition and exhaustion, pride and adaptation all braided into one inevitable cycle. But before we trace that spiral deeper, we must linger a moment longer in its height, to understand not only how it fell, but what it meant to live inside greatness as it began to fade. Because the story of Great Zimbabwe is not only about decline, it is about the fragile beauty of human creation, the ache of impermanence, and the mystery of how something built from stone could still vanish into air. To understand the fall of Great Zimbabwe, one must first understand the spirit that built it, the invisible thread of belief that bound stone to sky, ruler to people, and people to earth. For the kingdom's power did not rest on armies or conquest, but on harmony, an intricate balance between human will and the sacred rhythms of the land. The Shona world was not divided between the material and the spiritual. Both were one. Mountains and rivers held spirits, ancestors spoke through dreams and rituals, and every harvest, every rainstorm, every child born beneath the wide African sky was part of a cosmic dialogue. Great Zimbabwe was the physical manifestation of that belief, a city that sought to anchor the sacred in stone. Its great walls were not built for war. There are no signs of battle scars, no traces of enemy siege. These walls were built to awe, to separate the world of kings and spirits from the ordinary. The great enclosure, with its curving walls and silent corridors, was not a fortress but a symbol, a sacred space where ritual met authority. The conical tower that rises from within still stands like an enigma. Some say it represented fertility, others the continuity of kingship, others yet the granary, the very heart of sustenance and life. Within those walls, the Mambo stood as both ruler and priest, chosen by ancestry and believed to mediate between the living and the ancestors. He was not a king in the Western sense, for his power flowed from belief, not decree. To rule was to balance, between abundance and restraint, between generosity and order. And so long as that balance was kept, Great Zimbabwe thrived. But power is like fire, it must be tended carefully, for the same flame that warms can also consume. By the 14th century, the city's population may have reached 20,000, an enormous number for a settlement of its kind. Its success drew people from every direction, craftsmen, traders, farmers, priests. Yet with each new arrival, the equilibrium tilted further. More mouths to feed meant more land cultivated, more wood cut, more cattle driven through fragile pastures. The hills around the city, once cloaked in forest, grew bare. Erosion set in. The soil thinned. And as the trees vanished, so too did the rains begin to change. In the language of the Shona, to lose harmony with the land is to lose the favor of the ancestors. Drought was not merely weather, it was a message. Famine was not only hunger, it was imbalance made visible. In that fragile ecosystem, small changes had vast consequences. Crops failed, and cattle grew thin. People turned inward, clinging more tightly to ritual and prophecy, seeking to restore the order that seemed to slip from their hands. But in doing so, divisions deepened. Factions within the court vied for favor, whispering that the king had lost the ancestors' blessing. Power, once rooted in spiritual legitimacy, began to crack, and cracks, once begun, never stop at the surface. Far beyond the city's horizon, the world itself was shifting. The Indian Ocean trade was no longer the same vibrant corridor it had been. Kilwa, the great coastal kingdom that once flourished from Zimbabwe's gold, began to lose its grip. New trade centers were rising to the north, closer to the influence of Arabia and the expanding reach of Islam. The ocean winds carried not just goods, but new ideas, new beliefs, new powers. For Great Zimbabwe, this was both a threat and a mirror. While foreign empires expanded outward, Zimbabwe's strength had always been inward, drawn from the land and the spirit. Its people did not sail across oceans. They built inwardly, upwardly, into the earth. But isolation, once a source of protection, became a cage when the world began to change. The flow of trade that had once filled its markets slowed. Gold and ivory caravans turned to rival routes. Without that flow, the city's economy, the delicate system that connected farmers, miners, and artisans grew brittle. Wealth became harder to measure, tribute faltered. The court, desperate to sustain its splendor, demanded more from the land and its people, and so the soil weakened further. The people, once united in shared faith and purpose, began to scatter. Villages relocated to the peripheries, where fresh land still waited. Others followed the traders eastward, drawn to new opportunities along the routes to the coast. It was not an exodus, not yet, but it was a quiet draining of life from the heart of stone. As the population thinned, the city's silence deepened. The rituals continued, but with fewer hands to prepare the offerings, fewer drums to echo through the night. The sacred fires still burned, but their glow dimmed against the immensity of the stone walls. Even the birds seemed to have fewer songs to sing. Yet in that silence, something else stirred a strange kind of peace. For the walls themselves did not despair. They stood still, unmoved, watching the slow retreat of the people who had made them. And perhaps in some ancient way they understood that every civilization has its season, and that the stones, not the kings, would be the ones to remember. But even then, the end had not fully come. Around the year 1450, the kingdom still commanded respect. Its influence lingered in the distant regions of the plateau. But by the close of that century, its throne was empty. The sacred flames of the royal compound went out. The king's regalia, the drums, the spears, the carved birds, were carried away by his descendants, who sought new lands to rule. In their wake rose the kingdom of Mutapa, often called the Mana Mutapa by foreign traders. It was both successor and rival, built by men who once walked the walls of Great Zimbabwe, now setting their eyes further north, closer to the flow of commerce and the promise of renewed power. Mutapa inherited Zimbabwe's symbols, but not its soul. Its rulers wore the crown but no longer lived beneath sacred stone. Their cities were of earth, their wealth drawn directly from trade. The spiritual geometry that had given Zimbabwe its purpose was replaced by ambition and pragmatism. The world had changed, and in its new language of gold and profit, the old dialogue with the land was forgotten. And yet, even in ruin, Great Zimbabwe did not die. It endured as a memory, as myth, as a whisper of what had once been possible. Long after the last inhabitant left its walls, the name lingered like smoke. The Shona people still spoke of the houses of stone, where their ancestors had lived like kings. The songs that survived remembered not tragedy, but pride. Because for them, the fall of Great Zimbabwe was not an end, it was a transformation. Like the dry season before the rains, it was a time of waiting, of change. The stones remained, patient and silent, while the people carried their essence elsewhere, ensuring that what had been born there, their art, their faith, their sense of unity, would not vanish, only move. The city had fallen, yes, but its spirit had begun to scatter into 1,000 new seeds. Centuries passed, and the great city turned to myth. The jungle crept inward, wrapping its roots around the granite walls. Wind swept through corridors once filled with laughter and smoke. The once bustling courtyards became silent gardens of stone. Time, that patient sculptor, began to blur the edges of greatness. And yet, even in abandonment, Great Zimbabwe refused to vanish. Its ruins glowed with a stubborn kind of dignity, as if waiting for history to remember what memory had forgotten. For the descendants of those who once lived there, the ruins were sacred. They spoke of ancestors who had lived among the gods, who had built walls that touched the sky. The land around the ruins was still respected, still feared. Few dared to disturb it. To step among those stones without reverence was to invite misfortune, for it was said the spirits of the old kings still watched from the shadows, unseen, but present. But far away, in another world of parchment and maps, Great Zimbabwe was being rediscovered, not by its descendants, but by strangers. In the late 19th century, as European explorers cut their way through Africa, they stumbled upon the ruins and could not believe their eyes. a fortress of stone, rising from the savannah, walls higher than any castle in England, towers without mortar, perfectly curved and seamless. To them, it seemed impossible that such a thing could have been built by Africans. And so began one of the greatest distortions of African history. They called it a mystery. They wrote of lost white tribes, of Phoenicians from the Mediterranean, of Queen Sheba's outpost, of Solomon's mines. Every theory, no matter how far-fetched, found a home except the truth. That this was the work of African hands, guided by African minds. The denial was not born of curiosity, but of fear. For if Great Zimbabwe had been built by Africans, it meant the continent had produced an empire complex, sophisticated, and grand long before European colonization. It challenged the myths of superiority that justified conquest. So the truth was buried beneath layers of invention. Archaeologists came, spades in hand, digging not for understanding, but for confirmation of their prejudices. They searched for inscriptions in foreign scripts, for artifacts that might link the city to Arabia or Europe. When none appeared, they invented them. Reports were rewritten. Findings suppressed. Great Zimbabwe became a canvas for colonial imagination, a place where the brilliance of Africa was erased and replaced by the fantasies of empire. But the stones themselves refused to lie. Beneath the myths, real evidence remained. Pottery fired in local kilns, tools forged from nearby ore, ornaments made in the unmistakable style of Shona craftsmanship. The more the earth revealed, the harder it became to sustain the illusion. Slowly, a few voices of truth began to rise. They argued that the city was not foreign at all, but native, built by Africans who had mastered the art of dry stone architecture centuries before. In time, the truth emerged like grass after rain. Great Zimbabwe was indeed the heart of a powerful African civilization, one that had traded across the known world and built its greatness not on conquest, but on connection. Its fall had been gradual, born from the natural cycle of human ambition and environmental strain, not from invasion or foreign catastrophe. But by the time this truth was accepted, centuries of damage had already been done. To justify their rule, colonizers had painted Africa as a continent without history, its people as children in need of guidance. Great Zimbabwe, standing in silent defiance, told a different story, one that colonial powers could not bear to face. So they silenced it. When Cecil Rhodes claimed the territory in the 1890s, naming it Rhodesia, he understood the symbolic danger of Great Zimbabwe. If Africans could build such monuments, then how could they be said to need civilizing? To protect his narrative, Rhodes sponsored expeditions designed not to uncover the truth, but to obscure it. In 1902, a German explorer named Karl Mach visited the site and insisted that it must have been built by a northern people, perhaps the Queen of Sheba's subjects. Later, in the 1920s, British colonial archaeologist Gertrude Catton Thompson conducted a more honest excavation. Her findings were clear. The builders were African, their culture local and advanced. She wrote, "Examination of all available evidence reveals nothing inconsistent with the known native arts and industries of southern Africa." But her conclusions were inconvenient. The colonial government suppressed them, refusing to include them in official reports. Schools continued to teach that Great Zimbabwe was the work of outsiders. Even in ruin, the city was dangerous not for its walls or its ghosts, but for its truth. And yet truth, like water, finds its way. Decades later, African scholars, archaeologists, and elders reclaimed the story. They traced the lines of ancestry, the patterns of pottery, the echoes of language, until the identity of Great Zimbabwe shone once again. It had not been a legend of strangers, it had been their own. The world, at last, began to listen. The ruins were recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1986, a declaration not just of preservation, but of restitution. The name Zimbabwe, once confined to the stones, was reborn as the name of a nation. When independence came in 1980, The new country chose it proudly, reclaiming not only the land, but the legacy of greatness long denied. Today, the city of stone stands in both shadow and sunlight. Visitors walk its ancient pathways, tracing fingers along the curves of granite, laid by hands that understood balance and endurance. Birds nest among the ruins. Wind hums softly through gaps in the wall. The past is not dead here, it is dreaming. And yet, even in this dream, a question lingers like smoke over embers. Why do civilizations rise so high only to vanish? Why does glory fade into silence? And why do we return, again and again, to the ruins of our own making? Perhaps Great Zimbabwe's story is not one of failure, but of transformation. Perhaps the fall was not an ending, but a return, a cycle of creation, destruction, and renewal written into the pattern of all human endeavor. Because when the stones are gone, what remains is the idea, the belief that people, no matter where they are born, can shape greatness with their own hands. And if that is true, then Great Zimbabwe never truly fell. The ruins of Great Zimbabwe do not speak in words, yet they tell a story more eloquent than any written chronicle. Their silence is layered with pride, with sorrow, with the weight of centuries. To walk among them is to feel time itself exhale. The stones are warm beneath the sun, cool in the shadows, and alive with memory. Each wall, each curve, each narrow passage was once filled with meaning, and though the people have long departed, the intention of their hands still lingers like a pulse beneath the earth. To the eye it seems simple, a city built of granite blocks, dry-laid, standing without mortar. But in truth, it is a kind of language, a visual poem of stone. The walls do not form straight lines but flow in graceful arcs, mirroring the motion of hills and rivers. The builders of Great Zimbabwe worked with the land, not against it. Their architecture was organic, almost musical, rising and falling with the rhythm of nature. The stones were more than shelter. They were a declaration that the people who lived here belonged to this land, and this land belonged to them. And that belonging was the source of everything, of power, of prosperity, and eventually, of loss. For when the balance between people and place breaks, even stone can crack. The landscape around Great Zimbabwe had once been lush and forgiving. Streams ran clear, and the soil yielded crops in abundance. But the same prosperity that made the city thrive demanded constant fuel, timber for fires, wood for smelting, pasture for cattle, fields for grain. Slowly, imperceptibly, the land grew weary. Forests receded. The rains became uncertain. The people, once masters of the rhythm, began to move faster than nature could heal. By the 15th century, environmental strain had deepened into crisis. Archaeologists would later find evidence of overgrazing, deforestation, and soil depletion around the site. The hills that had once offered fertile slopes were stripped bare, leaving the red earth exposed. Droughts struck harder, and when the crops failed, hunger crept even into the royal enclosure. Yet in those same years the royal court still glittered. The king's attendants polished ivory bracelets and adorned him in leopard skins. Gold ornaments still gleamed in the sunlight. For a while, ritual and spectacle masked decline. But beneath the rhythm of drums, the rhythm of survival faltered. It is one of the oldest stories in the world, prosperity creating the conditions for its own undoing. And yet, Great Zimbabwe did not die in despair. The people who left its walls did not vanish, they adapted. They carried their knowledge, their traditions, their craftsmanship into new lands. The architecture of Great Zimbabwe echoed in other settlements across the plateau, smaller, humbler perhaps, but breathing with the same spirit. One such legacy was the kingdom of Mutapa, which rose to prominence in the north. Founded by Nyatsimba Mutoda, believed by tradition to have been a prince of Great Zimbabwe, this new empire inherited both the mantle and the lesson of its predecessor. Mutapa would dominate the gold trade for the next 2 centuries, its influence stretching from the heart of the plateau to the coast. But even Mutapa could not escape the changing winds of history. For beyond Africa's shores, the world was shifting. The 15th century was an age of movement, of ships and empires, of exploration and conquest. The Portuguese had rounded the Cape and begun to probe the East African coast. The old trade routes that had once carried Zimbabwe's gold through Swahili intermediaries were now being redrawn by foreign powers hungry for direct control. The arrival of Europeans in southern Africa was like a distant thundercloud on the horizon, unseen by the people of Zimbabwe, yet already rumbling toward them. By the time their echoes reached the high plateau, the city of stone had long been silent. Its power diffused into the kingdoms that followed. But its legacy remained a reminder that greatness, though fragile, could be born from within Africa itself. To understand the fall of Great Zimbabwe is also to understand the rise of those who came after. Mutapa's rulers claimed descent from the kings of Zimbabwe, invoking their sacred ancestry to legitimize their authority. They ruled vast territories, commanding tribute from distant chieftains. But unlike the stone builders of old, they turned their gaze outward to trade, to foreign diplomacy, to the shifting tides of global commerce. And in that pivot lay both survival and danger. Where Great Zimbabwe's strength had been its isolation, its deep-rootedness in the land, Mutapa's strength became its openness. Gold flowed again, now directly into the hands of Portuguese traders, and with it came weapons, religion, and ambition. The rhythm that had once been shaped by seasons and rain was now dictated by markets and muskets. The old balance between people, ancestors, and earth was fading. The sacred architecture of Great Zimbabwe gave way to outposts of trade and fortifications of defense. Where once the Shona kings had ruled from hills crowned with stone, they now sat in courts influenced by foreign tongues. This was the long echo of Great Zimbabwe's fall, the transformation of independence into entanglement. Yet the stones still held their own kind of resistance. Through centuries of colonial conquest and denial, they stood unmoved, silent witnesses to a truth that could not be erased, that Africa had known civilization, power, and beauty long before Europe's arrival. Even today, when the evening sun settles over the ruins, the light touches every wall with the same reverence it did 600 years ago. Baboons still cross the ramparts. The grass still sways where once the courtiers walked. And if you stand quietly, you can almost hear the faint echo of drums, the murmur of a city that refuses to die. Because perhaps Great Zimbabwe did not fall at all, it transformed. Its end was not destruction, but diffusion. Its people became the rivers that flowed outward, carrying with them fragments of its genius. The empire of stone became the spirit of endurance. And yet, the question still stirs like wind among the ruins. Why do human civilizations rise toward the heavens only to sink back into earth? Why does every monument we build seem destined to become a ruin? Perhaps because stone cannot contain the whole of what we are. Civilizations, like people, are born from need and imagination. They rise from the ground in defiance of impermanence, and yet their greatness depends on humility before nature, before time, before the unseen forces that give and take. Great Zimbabwe's builders understood this once. They built in curves, not lines, as if to acknowledge that nothing in this world is forever straight. Their wisdom lives on in the pattern of their walls, in the humility of their design. And perhaps that is the truest legacy of all, that even in their decline, they left behind not arrogance, but harmony. The sun rises over the plateau, just as it did centuries ago. The first light spills across the granite ruins of Great Zimbabwe, and the stones ignite with color: amber, copper, gold. Birds weave through the morning air, their calls echoing faintly against the walls that once enclosed kings. The city may be silent, but it is not dead. It breathes through the wind, through the soil, through the memory of the people who still call this land home. To understand its fall is to look not only backward, but inward. Civilizations, after all, do not collapse in isolation. They mirror the hearts of those who build them. Great Zimbabwe was born from faith in order, in balance, in connection between people and land. When that bond frayed, the stones themselves could no longer hold. There are moments in history when the earth seems to whisper warnings. The rains come late, the herds thin, the forests retreat. And still, people push forward, unable to imagine that the rhythm of abundance could end. It is in this blindness, this faith in permanence, that decline often begins. Archaeological traces tell us that as the 14th century waned, life inside the great enclosure began to change. The layers of ash found in the hearths grow thinner. The pottery fragments shift in design simpler, more hurried, less ornamented. The houses once rebuilt with care were left to crumble, and new ones sprang up farther from the walls, scattered across the hills. The people were moving outward. The center was losing its gravity. It is tempting to imagine this as tragedy, the slow hollowing of greatness, but perhaps it was also an act of wisdom. The people of Zimbabwe were not conquered, they dispersed. They followed the rivers to new lands, carrying their cattle and their traditions. In their leaving, they preserved what could still live. For the earth beneath Great Zimbabwe had grown weary. Centuries of use had stripped it bare. Even if faith had remained unbroken, the soil could no longer feed the city. To stay would have been to starve, so they left. Not as refugees, but as gardeners carrying seeds from a dying tree. Those seeds would grow elsewhere in Mutapa, in Torwa, in Rasvi, each kingdom a new bloom of the same ancient root. Yet the memory of the stone city endured. Its name traveled with them, whispered in praise songs, evoked in prayers. To invoke Zimbabwe was to speak of greatness, of unity, of what humanity could achieve when guided by both skill and spirit. And still, the world around them shifted. The Portuguese, having reached the Indian Ocean, began to cast their gaze inland. To them, Africa was a map of resources waiting to be claimed. They heard tales from Swahili traders of a city of gold that lay somewhere beyond the horizon, a city now abandoned, but whose riches, they imagined, still shimmered beneath the soil. They called it the land of Ophir, the mythical source of King Solomon's wealth. The legend suited their ambition. When Portuguese envoys and explorers ventured into the region in the early 1500s, they found not a golden city but a living culture kingdoms that still traded, mined, and ruled with confidence. But they could not see what was before them. Their eyes were clouded by greed and myth. They recorded stories of hidden treasure, of secret mines guarded by spirits, of ruins left by ancient foreigners. And so, the lie was reborn, that greatness could not be African unless it was borrowed. In truth, the gold of Zimbabwe had never lain idle, it flowed quietly, reshaped by the hands of those who survived its fall. But now, for the first time, it flowed under the shadow of foreign flags. The Portuguese began to insert themselves into the trade routes, offering goods, demanding tribute, sowing conflict among rival kingdoms. Where Great Zimbabwe had once stood as the center of an independent network, now the successors of its people found themselves entangled in a global web woven far from their lands. The echo of the stone city grew fainter. But if the story of Great Zimbabwe's fall is a warning, it is also a mirror held up to all of humanity. We see ourselves in those stones, in their endurance, their fragility, their quiet reminder that even the grandest achievements can erode when we forget where our strength truly lies. For at its height, Great Zimbabwe was not built on conquest, nor on extraction, but on balance, on the understanding that prosperity was a dialogue with nature, not a domination of it. Its builders shaped the land gently, honoring its contours, reading its rhythms. It was only when that dialogue turned into demand that the balance broke. And is that not the same rhythm we repeat, again and again, across the world? Civilizations rise on harmony and fall when they begin to believe they stand above it. When we strip forests without thought, when we take more than the soil can bear, when the bonds between power and responsibility fray, then the fall begins quietly, invisibly, like cracks forming beneath polished stone. In this way, Great Zimbabwe is not only history, it is prophecy. Because somewhere in its story lies the pattern of all empires: Rome, Angkor, Maya, and perhaps even our own modern world of glass and steel. Each believed itself eternal. Each carved its identity into the landscape. Each thought its ingenuity could outlast time. And each, in the end, returned to dust. Yet perhaps that is not failure, but a kind of grace. The stones do not weep for what was lost. They accept the cycle. They endure the passage of wind and rain, content to remain, to teach, to remind. When archaeologists kneel in the dust of Great Zimbabwe, brushing centuries from a shard of pottery, they are not only uncovering the past, they are touching a truth about the future. That everything we build, cities, nations, empires, is a conversation with time, and time always has the last word. And yet, even time cannot erase meaning. The spirit that once filled these walls lives on in the language, in the rhythm of the drum, in the pride of a nation that took the city's name as its own. Perhaps the fall of Great Zimbabwe was never meant to be mourned, but understood. Because the stones still stand. And when the wind moves through them, it sounds almost like breath. The stones breathe, yes, but so do the people who descend from them. In every song sung in Shona, in every carving of soapstone, in every ritual that calls to the ancestors, there echoes the heartbeat of Great Zimbabwe. What was once thought lost was never gone. It was only waiting, patient as granite, beneath the shifting sands of time. When we look upon those walls today, we see ruins. But to those who built them, they were living things. They curved like rivers because life itself was not straight. They enclosed the sacred not to imprison it, but to protect it. They spoke of permanence without arrogance, of power without cruelty. That is the paradox of Great Zimbabwe. It was built to last forever, yet its creators understood that forever is not the same as unchanging. Civilizations are like the rains. They come, they nourish, they fade, and they return in another form. And so the legacy of Great Zimbabwe found new life in its people, scattered but not broken. Across the centuries that followed its decline, they continued to trade, to build, to weave, to worship. The Shona world became a tapestry of smaller kingdoms, each holding a fragment of the old city's soul. Their languages evolved, their stories intertwined, but their sense of ancestry remained unshaken. Even when colonial borders divided the land, even when foreign tongues renamed rivers and mountains, the memory of the stone city endured, an unspoken defiance. In the 20th century, as Africa began to stir toward independence, Great Zimbabwe became more than a ruin, it became a symbol. A reminder that long before colonizers arrived, Africans had built greatness. It was proof carved in stone that civilization on this continent was not imported, but indigenous. Young nations looked to those walls and saw themselves. The dream of liberation, of self-rule, found its reflection in the ruins that had resisted erasure. In the 1970s, when revolution spread through the land once called Rhodesia, the name Zimbabwe returned like thunder after a long drought. It was chosen deliberately, an act of reclamation, a declaration of identity. When independence was won in 1980, the name became official, the Republic of Zimbabwe. A nation born from the ashes of empire took its title from the stones of its ancestors. It was a poetic circle closed, where once Great Zimbabwe had ruled through faith and unity. Now its spirit guided a people emerging from the long shadow of colonialism. The ruins, once used to deny African greatness, became the monument to its rebirth. Standing among those walls today, one can feel that continuity. The voices that once filled the air with song may be gone, but their descendants walk the same paths. Children laugh where kings once spoke. The sacred birds of stone, their wings outstretched, still watch over the land. The silence between the walls is no longer emptiness, it is reverence. But the stones also whisper warnings. They remind us that power, no matter how glorious, is fragile. That harmony between people and land must be tended, not taken for granted. The same cycles that brought Great Zimbabwe its prosperity also brought its decline. The pull of greed, the exhaustion of the earth, the slow forgetting of what connects us to our beginnings. And perhaps that is the truest reason the city fell, not because of invasion or famine alone, but because the rhythm that bound humanity to the natural world grew faint. It is an old story, repeated in every age. The Maya lost their forests to their pyramids. The Mesopotamians turned fertile valleys into salt. The Romans consumed their empire faster than they could sustain it. Each civilization rose believing it was different, that it had mastered the balance. And yet, in the end, they all faced the same truth. No empire outlasts the soil beneath it. But unlike many others, Great Zimbabwe did not burn in conquest or drown in catastrophe. It withdrew. It listened. It allowed itself to fade rather than be destroyed. In that, there's a strange kind of wisdom, a graceful exit written into the design of the city itself. To walk through it now is to walk through time that has chosen peace. The passageways curve inward like the folds of memory. Lichens bloom on the granite like the soft handwriting of nature reclaiming her canvas. And in that embrace between human creation and natural return, one finds something rare. Balance restored. Modern Zimbabweans know this. Each year, people come to the ruins not only to remember, but to reconnect, to feel the grounding of their ancestry beneath their feet. Ceremonies are held in the shadow of the great enclosure. Offerings of millet and beer poured upon the soil, songs rising into the twilight. They are not mourning. They are conversing with those who came before and those yet to come. In the flicker of firelight against the stone, the centuries seem to fold in upon themselves. The air thickens with presence. It is said that in those moments, the ancestors return, listening, smiling, unseen. The fall of Great Zimbabwe, then, is not merely a historical event. It is a spiritual lesson. It teaches that greatness is not measured by the height of walls, but by the depth of harmony. That wealth without balance turns to burden. That when we lose our reverence for the earth that sustains us, our empires crumble not from without, but from within. And so, the ruins stand as both monument and mirror. They reflect the glory of what was achieved, and the humility of what was lost. They ask us gently to remember that we too are builders of cities, of nations, of futures, and that one day, the wind will move through what we leave behind. If we listen carefully, perhaps we can still hear what the stones are trying to say. Do not build only to be remembered. Build to belong. Because belonging endures long after the walls have fallen. There is a stillness to Great Zimbabwe that feels almost sacred, as if the air itself guards the last breath of a vanished age. When the wind moves through the tall grass, it sounds like voices speaking in a language older than memory. You cannot help but feel watched, not by ghosts, but by history itself, alive in the stones, alive in the silence. It is a silence full of meaning. For centuries, scholars, poets, and travelers have come to this place seeking answers. Who built it? Why did it fall? And what remains of the people who once called it home? Yet the stones do not yield their secrets easily. They remind us that not all knowledge can be excavated. Some must be felt. Archaeologists have uncovered much evidence of trade, craftsmanship, environmental change, but there are things no excavation can measure. The sound of a drum echoing through the valley at dusk, the smell of grain roasting in clay pots, the rhythm of feet dancing in the moonlight during the harvest festival. Those things live now only in imagination, but they are no less real. To reconstruct the fall of Great Zimbabwe is to weave together both science and spirit. From the archaeological record, we see the signs of strain, soil exhaustion, deforestation, dwindling rainfall. We see the disappearance of imported goods from coastal trade, replaced by simpler, locally made objects. We see shifts in population density as people moved outward, forming new communities. And we see the quiet end, not in fire or conquest, but in abandonment. But from the oral traditions we glimpse something deeper. The elders speak of imbalance, of forgotten rituals, of the ancestors withdrawing their protection. They tell of a time when the people grew proud, when the king's advisors ceased to listen to the spirit mediums who guided the realm. In their stories, the fall was not only environmental, it was moral, spiritual, cyclical. And perhaps, in that union of science and story, we find the truest version of events. For history is never just about what happened, it is about what it meant. Great Zimbabwe's decline was the meeting of two currents, the material and the spiritual. When the rains failed and the trade routes shifted, when the forests thinned and the land cracked with drought, it was more than a crisis of survival, it was a test of belief. The balance between humanity and nature, between king and people, between past and future, had been disrupted. And so the city exhaled. It released its people back into the land from which they had come. It is tempting to call this collapse, but that is the language of outsiders, of those who measure greatness in conquest and continuity. For those who understand the rhythm of the land, the dispersal of Great Zimbabwe's people was not defeat. It was transformation. Like seeds carried on the wind, they spread the essence of their civilization across the plains. The architecture of stone would never again reach such grandeur, but the architecture of spirit, of belief, of identity endured. Even in the centuries of colonial distortion, when the name of Zimbabwe was twisted into myth, the spirit remained alive in the stories of the Shona. Parents told their children of a place where kings had ruled wisely, where the stone spoke to the sky, where people lived in harmony with one another and with the earth. The ruin became a symbol of something sacred, not lost, but waiting. And when independence came, when the colonial world began to crumble, it was to those stones that a people returned. Today, the ruins of Great Zimbabwe are both a heritage site and a living altar. Pilgrims come to pray, to pour libations, to ask for blessings from the ancestors. Historians come to study, to measure, to map. And travelers from distant lands come to marvel, trying to capture with their cameras what can only truly be felt through silence. The stones do not distinguish between them. They welcome all who approach with humility. But they also judge quietly those who do not. Because Great Zimbabwe is more than a relic, it is a reminder. It asks uncomfortable questions about our own age. We too live in a time of vast power and fragile balance. Our cities rise higher than any before. Our machines move faster than wind or horse, and our reach extends beyond the earth itself. But beneath all our triumphs lies the same old tension, between creation and consumption, between wisdom and pride. If Great Zimbabwe teaches anything, it is that no empire, no matter how advanced, can outlast its own imbalance. The soil has a memory. The sky keeps its own account. In the stones of Great Zimbabwe lies a silent warning. When we forget our dialogue with the earth, when we turn wealth into worship and wisdom into noise, the silence will return, slowly at first, then suddenly. And yet, there is hope in that warning too. For every ending carries the seed of renewal. The people who left Great Zimbabwe did not vanish, they adapted. They changed their ways, found new lands, built new forms of community. The city they left behind became a teacher. Its ruins taught humility. Its memory taught pride. It was proof that greatness could be achieved without conquest, that knowledge could be passed down without writing, that beauty could emerge from understanding, not domination. In that way, Great Zimbabwe remains not only Africa's monument, but humanity's mirror. It stands for the possibility of balance, a world where art, trade, and faith could exist in harmony. And it stands as a warning of what happens when that harmony is broken. If you visit at dusk, when the horizon glows orange and purple, you might see the shadows stretch across the walls like the ghosts of the builders themselves. The air cools. The scent of dust and wild grass fills your lungs. For a moment, it feels as though the city is alive again, breathing, dreaming, remembering. And in that quiet, you might hear it, the faint hum of a civilization that still speaks, not in words, but in presence, It does not ask for pity. It does not ask for awe. It asks only to be understood. Because every ruin is a lesson, and every lesson is a chance to begin again. Night settles slowly over the hills of Great Zimbabwe. The last light slides down the granite walls, and the air cools, carrying the scent of dry grass and distant rain. The stars emerge one by one, sharp and bright as the eyes of ancestors. In the dark, the ruins no longer seem like relics, they seem alive. The stones catch the moonlight as if remembering their old purpose, as if waiting for voices to return. Perhaps in some sense, they have never truly gone. For centuries, the descendants of the builders kept faith with this place, not with monuments or maps, but with memory. They passed down the story of a city built by their forebears, a place where spirit and stone met as equals. Even when outsiders denied it, they held fast to the truth. And that truth, quietly, outlasted every lie told in its shadow. In the early 1900s, when colonial officials stood among the ruins and declared, "This could not have been the work of Africans," the ancestors must have smiled. The stones themselves seemed to hum in defiance, whispering, "We are still here. We remember." Over time, the truth rose from beneath the dust. Scholars began to see the evidence for what it was. The tools and pottery, the trade goods, the continuity of design all spoke of African genius. No Phoenicians, no lost Hebrews, no ghosts of Sheba, only the enduring intelligence of the people of this land. And as the lie unraveled, something remarkable happened. The stones began to heal their silence. They became a rallying point, a beacon for a people reclaiming their story. Great Zimbabwe was no longer a curiosity to be studied. It became a symbol of dignity, of self-determination, of belonging. To speak its name was to remember that Africa's history did not begin with colonization. It began with creation. But even symbols must bear the weight of expectation. In the years following independence, the name Zimbabwe became a promise, a return to pride, to self-rule, to the rhythm of the ancestors. The nation embraced the grandeur of its namesake. But just as the ancient city had once flourished and faltered, the modern republic too would find itself tested. The parallels are haunting. Where the old kingdom had wrestled with the exhaustion of its soil, the new one faced the exhaustion of its economy. Where ancient kings had balanced power through ritual and consensus, modern leaders wrestled with corruption, division, and the temptation of control. The rains came and went. The harvests rose and fell. And once again, the question of balance returned. It is as if the spirit of the old city still watches, reminding those who lead. Greatness is not inherited. It must be renewed. For the people, Great Zimbabwe remains more than a ruin. It is a measure of what can be achieved and a reminder of what can be lost. School children visit the site and walk through the great enclosure, tracing their hands along the cool stone. Guides tell them of the ingenuity of their ancestors, the way each block was shaped by hand, the way walls were built to curve with the landscape, not cut against it. They listen in awe and perhaps, for a moment, feel taller. Because these walls say something profound. You come from builders, from dreamers, from those who turned earth into eternity. The ruins have become both classroom and cathedral. Archaeologists study them to uncover patterns of trade and agriculture, while spiritual leaders visit to commune with the ancestors. Weddings are sometimes held nearby, the vows echoing softly against the ancient granite, as if to ask for the blessing of history itself. And when the wind passes through, it carries a low hum, a tone like memory. But memory, if left untended, can fade. The challenge for the modern world is not only to preserve Great Zimbabwe as stones, but to preserve its lesson. The ruins are strong, but they are not immortal. Rain wears them down, roots pry them apart. Tourists climb where they should not. Governments neglect where they should protect. The story could repeat itself, another rise, another slow decline, another silence, unless we learn. Because the fall of Great Zimbabwe was never just about the end of a city. It was about the consequences of imbalance. When leaders forget their responsibility to the land, when ambition outpaces wisdom, when people lose their sense of collective purpose, the center collapses. The stones do not lie. And so, even now, as the nation named for it faces its own trials, economic hardship, political unrest, and the pressures of a changing world, the ruins stand as both comfort and caution. They say, "You have been here before. You can endure again." Each generation must build its own Great Zimbabwe, not with stone perhaps, but with integrity, with unity, with vision. The old city was a masterpiece of architecture. The new one must be a masterpiece of balance. Because the true legacy of the stone builders was not their walls. It was their understanding that greatness is a shared labor. No one person built Great Zimbabwe. It was the work of thousands moving together, guided by a common rhythm. When that rhythm faltered, the city faded. When it was strong, it touched eternity. And so the ruins stand, not as monuments to failure, but as invitations to begin again. If you stand atop the hill complex at dawn, when the valley below fills with mist, you can see the outlines of the great enclosure glowing faintly in the first light. From there, the whole landscape feels alive, the stones like vertebrae in the spine of the earth. The wind moves softly, as if carrying a voice that says, "Remember who you are. Remember what you can be." Because every civilization, no matter how far it rises, must one day return to this question: did we live in balance, or did we live in hunger? Great Zimbabwe's fall answers without bitterness. It fell not because it was weak, but because it was human. And humanity, for all its brilliance, is bound to cycles of creation, destruction, renewal. The genius of the builders was not in avoiding that cycle, but in leaving behind something beautiful enough to guide those who came after. The stones endure. And through them, so do we. At dawn, the valley of Great Zimbabwe glows with a strange, quiet light. Mist curls upward from the earth, wrapping the ancient walls in a veil of silver. For a few moments, the ruins seem suspended between worlds, half dream, half memory. It is in this stillness that the full meaning of the city reveals itself. This was never just a city of stone. It was a city of spirit, a monument not to wealth or war, but to connection. Connection between people and land, ruler and ruled, the living and the ancestors. That, above all, is what made it great. And that, above all, is what time sought to test. As we trace the story of its fall, the pieces begin to fit together like the stones of its walls, each resting perfectly upon the next. No mortar, no single cause, just balance. A balance that once held firm, then slowly gave way. The land that had fed them grew tired. The forests that had sheltered them grew thin. The trade that had sustained them began to shift. The faith that had guided them began to falter. And yet, in their leaving, they did not curse the land or abandon their gods. They moved onward, carrying the lessons of balance and belonging. That is the quiet dignity of Great Zimbabwe. It did not collapse in flame or arrogance. It receded with grace, allowing the cycle of renewal to continue. It is a humility few civilizations have ever managed. The builders seem to understand that permanence is not found in endurance, but in example. They built not to defy time, but to speak through it. Their work was not merely architectural, it was philosophical. Each curve of wall and shape of passage reflected an understanding of harmony. The city was not imposed upon the landscape. It was drawn from it. That wisdom feels achingly relevant now. In our age, the world is full of noise, endless striving, endless hunger, endless building. We pile glass upon steel, push farther, faster, higher. Yet somewhere in that pursuit, we risk losing what the builders of Great Zimbabwe once knew, that true greatness lies not in dominance, but in rhythm. That our survival depends not on conquest, but on communion. They understood that the land is not a resource, it is a relative. When they cut stone, they followed the natural grain. When they chose where to build, they listened to the contours of the hills. When they raised walls, they curved them with the flow of the earth. Even their departure, when the soil could no longer give, was an act of harmony and acceptance that to stay would be to wound the very world that had given them life. How many of us today would have the wisdom to do the same? We call their departure a fall. Perhaps it was, in part. But perhaps it was also an awakening, a return to humility. A reminder that greatness, untempered by balance, becomes burden. And so, the city that once ruled through abundance became a teacher through absence. When the Portuguese and the British later stood upon its walls, they saw only ruin. They did not hear the language of balance because they had never learned to listen. They came from worlds that valued possession above harmony, mastery above understanding. To them, Great Zimbabwe was a mystery because they mistook silence for ignorance. But the stones were never silent. They were simply speaking in a tongue the world had forgotten. Over the centuries, as myths were replaced by truth, the meaning of the ruins deepened. No longer the imagined outpost of some lost Mediterranean empire, they became a mirror of African ingenuity, proof that Africa had built, traded, and thrived long before the world arrived to take. Today, historians and spiritual leaders alike speak of Great Zimbabwe not as a relic, but as a compass. Its rise teaches the power of vision. Its endurance teaches the strength of craft. Its fall teaches the necessity of humility. And together, those lessons form a map for humanity itself. The builders are gone, but their rhythm remains in the fields of modern Zimbabwe, in the pattern of its villages, in the songs sung at harvest, in the quiet pride of a people who know that their history was written not in ink, but in stone. Each visitor who stands among the ruins joins that rhythm. The stones seem to hum with a frequency deeper than hearing. Perhaps it is imagination, perhaps it is memory. But you can feel it, a slow, steady pulse that seems to rise from the ground itself, the earth remembering its own creation. As sunlight touches the conical tower, the walls seem to breathe. A bird calls from the high ledge. Somewhere beyond the valley, a cow bellows, and suddenly, the centuries collapse. You can see it, the city alive again. Women grinding grain, men tending fires, children laughing in the courtyards, smoke curling above the great enclosure. Then the vision fades, and you are left with the whisper of wind and the truth of impermanence. All things return to the earth. All empires become stories. All stories become lessons. That is the legacy of Great Zimbabwe, to remind us that impermanence is not failure, it is freedom. Because what endures is not the stone, but the idea. The idea that humanity, when guided by respect for its world, can create something transcendent. That even in silence, greatness speaks. That even in ruin, beauty remains. When dawn turns to day and the mist burns away, the walls reveal their true color, golden gray, glowing softly beneath the sun. You realize then that the miracle of Great Zimbabwe was not that it fell, but that it ever existed at all. A civilization built from earth, guided by spirit, remembered by silence. And as you walk away, you cannot help but feel a quiet reverence, an awareness that what they built was not meant to be eternal, but to teach eternity itself. Because even now, centuries later, the stones are still speaking. If we listen, perhaps we can hear what they are trying to say. If you listen closely, beyond the whisper of the wind and the call of distant birds, you can almost hear them, the faint, rhythmic echoes of life that once filled these walls. The sound of pounding grain, the murmur of traders exchanging words across languages, the laughter of children beneath a sky so wide it could swallow empires. The heartbeat of a city that believed, in its quiet way, that stone could capture the soul of the world. Great Zimbabwe was more than a marvel of architecture. It was an idea made real. It was proof that civilization could bloom wherever the human spirit took root, that greatness did not need marble columns or imperial armies to announce itself. It was greatness drawn from soil, from river, From memory, a civilization in tune with its surroundings, built not to dominate the world, but to belong within it. And yet, belonging is fragile. When the rhythm between people and the land began to falter, the song unraveled thread by thread. The fields could no longer give, the forests no longer shield, the rivers no longer whisper their abundance. But the end was not a single moment. It was a slow exhale, a people learning to let go of what could no longer be held. To the outsiders who later found it, this stillness looked like death, but they were wrong. Death is absence. This was continuity. The life that had once pulsed through the stone walls simply flowed elsewhere, into new kingdoms, new valleys, new generations. The spirit of Great Zimbabwe became unbound, moving like wind, invisible yet everywhere. It traveled north into the Mutapa kingdom, where rulers would claim descent from the stone kings and continue the trade in gold. It traveled west, carried by cattle herders and artisans who built smaller stone enclosures in the same curving style. It traveled inward, into the cultural memory of a people who would remember, across centuries, that once there had been a place where stone and spirit were one. That memory was powerful enough to survive the storms of colonialism, denial, and distance. It endured when maps were redrawn and names erased. It endured when the story of the city was stolen and twisted into myth. And it endured long enough to reclaim itself, to rise again as both name and nation. The Republic of Zimbabwe carries more than a word from its ancestors. It carries a vow that the story of this land will no longer be told by those who tried to erase it. That the stones will speak again, and this time their voice will be heard. But the ruins also hold another lesson, quieter and more demanding, that to honor the past is not simply to celebrate it, but to learn from it. For even now, the same forces that once tested Great Zimbabwe still shape our world. The exhaustion of the land, the hunger for gold, literal or symbolic, the illusion that progress can be measured by growth alone, the forgetting of balance. We build our own walls now of concrete, of glass, of data, and call them eternal. We stretch the earth thinner each year, confident that ingenuity will replace what humility once preserved. And yet, beneath our towers, the same truth waits. No structure can stand if it loses harmony with its foundation. The fall of Great Zimbabwe is not only history, it is prophecy. It tells us that civilizations do not collapse because they are weak, but because they grow deaf to the voices that once guided them. The voices of the land, the ancestors, the rivers. The wisdom that reminds us that the world gives only as much as it receives. The builders of Zimbabwe listened. That is why their city stood for centuries, balanced on the edge of miracle. And when the balance broke, they did not rage against the inevitable. They yielded to it. They stepped aside, allowing time to reclaim what they had borrowed. That is not failure, that is grace. And perhaps that is the truest kind of greatness, not defiance, but understanding. To know when to build and when to let go. When the first European explorers wrote of Great Zimbabwe, they saw only what they wished to see, a mystery that confirmed their prejudice, a monument stripped of its people. They called it a riddle, a ruin, a lost civilization. But the people of this land never called it lost, they called it home. Because for them, Great Zimbabwe was never gone, it was simply waiting to be recognized. Today, when schoolchildren visit the ruins, they do not see decay, they see proof. Proof that their ancestors were builders, dreamers, engineers of beauty. Proof that the story of civilization does not begin and end in Greece or Rome, but stretches across the continents like a shared heartbeat. Proof that Africa, too, carved eternity into stone. They climb the steps of the hill complex and look out across the plains, where the wind moves like a living thing. Below them lies the great enclosure, its walls coiling in endless circles. Beyond that, the valley opens toward the horizon, the same horizon their ancestors once crossed with cattle and gold and faith. And somewhere in that view, they can see themselves connected not by blood alone, but by belonging. That is what Great Zimbabwe offers the modern world, not nostalgia, but perspective. It reminds us that civilization is not a ladder but a circle. That progress is not about escape from the earth, but harmony with it. That greatness is not about conquest, but continuity. The city fell, yes, but only in form. Its essence remains. It lives in the pride of a nation that bears its name. It lives in the rhythm of drums that echo its heart. It lives in every hand that shapes stone, or tills soil, or raises children with the same quiet hope that built the first walls. That what we build today might speak for us tomorrow. The stones of Great Zimbabwe still stand because they were made to endure not just wind and rain. They remind us that even when history turns its gaze elsewhere, truth waits, patient as granite. And in that patience lies a kind of immortality. For in the end, the city did not vanish. It became what all great creations must become. A story, a lesson, a prayer whispered to the future. It stands as a monument not to loss, but to resilience, not to ruin, but to renewal. And when the last rays of sunlight strike the stone tower, when the shadows stretch long across the savannah, it feels as though the city exhales again, still breathing, still teaching, still alive. The question that began our journey, what caused the fall of Great Zimbabwe, no longer feels like an ending. It feels like an invitation to listen, to learn, to remember. Because the city may have fallen, but its meaning has not. In its silence, it speaks still of beauty and humility, of power and impermanence, of the unbreakable bond between people and the world that shapes them. And as long as that bond endures, so too will the spirit of Great Zimbabwe.